Talking more, yeah.
Talking.
You guys are talking.
We're talking.
Oh, really?
A lot of talkers.
I would agree with that.
This podcast is called Erase the Filter.
Erase the filter.
Erase the filter.
I was asked by the museum here in Nelson to do a sound art installation, and I decided to make a piece involving wooden records. So the life rings in a tree are kind of like the grooves in a record.
Gregor Ash, also known as DJ Olive, is an electronic and ambient musician, as well as a visual artist living in the mountains of British Columbia, Canada. He helped create a fresh experimental music and art scene in the early 90s in Brooklyn, New York, forming an art collective called La La Landia, and performing in the electronic and dance music scenes. So prior to moving to the small town of Nelson, British Columbia in the late 2000s, his 2018 sound art installation called Listening to Fur at the Touchstone's Nelson Museum of Art and History may have seemed unlikely. But after spending time working on a portable sawmill and constructing with the native woods of his adopted home area, Olive was inspired to consider the life rings of fir trees as wooden records, going so far as playing slices of these trees on old turntables to see what they sounded like. The project evolved into a full sound art installation that would include ambient music from early in his career. Erase the Filter contributor Dave Bellard caught up with Olive to dig a little deeper into this project. Here's DJ Olive.
Okay, so I was invited here in Nelson by the Touchstones Museum to do a sound art installation, and I proposed an omnisensorial piece, and they said, great. So when I first got here to Canada, I had to work on a portable sawmill. And one of the things I noticed was that when you look at the end of a log, you see the life rings of the tree, and the life rings kind of look like the rings, the grooves in a record. So this was like 7 years ago that I had this idea to make these wooden records. So I managed to get my buddy with a sawmill to slice the log standing up on the mill. So basically cutting little cookie slices off the log, and then using a wire brush attachment on a grinder, I kind of raised the grain along the outside of these record shapes and kind of formed them into records where the grain was like really revealed on both sides. And I made about 100 of those and hung them in this gallery space, and then used a projection of water, bubbling water. And I also filmed these wooden records up really close with a really high quality macro lens, so that that was projected, 3 giant projections of the kind of grain of these records rolling past.
The videos were projected with these super close-up sort of journeys along the grooves of the wooden records.
So I spent days like putting these records on an old turntable I have that goes 16 RPMs, and then with a GoPro and a macro attachment, I sort of filmed all the records, but just the grooves, like so close in, you can't see anything but the grooves. And projected a sort of 3 different sequences of like 1 minute clips. So I projected those on kind of like black cloth. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing you have to go inside of. It's a omnisensorial space, and it smells like fur. There's all these fur records. You can touch them. There's projections of the grooves. So there's kind of like the macro. But it's really like a technorganic garden that you can go in and sit down. I made a big bench, which is kind of like a raft in the middle of the room out of big slabs of wood, and then you can sit there and hang out and just kind of drift off thinking about whatever it is you need to think about. And the listening to fur is really just a vehicle for you to do that. It's like a garden, a space for you to just check out for a little bit.
You did try to listen to the records. You tried to play them actually on a record player, right?
Yeah, I thought that might be cool. So I put some of the ones where I really raised the grain. I put those on an old turntable and played them at different speeds, and then used effects. But it was very industrial sounding, like and they all basically sounded the same. I tried to slow it down in the computer and use max patches to make it into something, but in the end I found it makes for a really good short video that you might watch. But for this piece, I wanted the viewer to really be able to go inside this garden. So I found a piece of music I've been working on for about 6 years, a collection of ambient tracks. It was going to be my new sleeping pill, but it just worked perfect for this and as the soundtrack. So that's I played that back through some really nice sound equipment.
What inspired you first to make this installation? I worked on a sawmill when I first got here to Canada, a small portable sawmill, and just, sitting around on breaks, looking at the ends of the logs and thinking about life and sort of life rings on trees as sort of metaphor for our own lives, and that looking like a record, and the record is kind of like the rings of our memories and all this kind of stuff. I just found it like really resonating to me as a DJ and someone that has a bit of a fetish for vinyl. So I had been for 8 years trying to find a way to kind of make these records and see if it would work, because when you cut the log that way, it tends to check and break because you're sort of cutting it across the grain. So they can fracture really easy. So there was a lot of technical issues that I came up against, and that was also exciting and fun. And I hope to make a lot more. I have a whole new process of how to do it. It seems an really interesting way of incorporating your environment too, because you live in the wilds of British Columbia up in Canada, right?
Yeah, in the mountains.
DJ Olive's ambient work includes 3 collections of tracks that he calls sleeping pills. These mixes span an hour each and were created to act as the title suggests, to help the listener relax into a deep meditative sleep.
I'd have to go back to the early 90s when I was collecting a lot of records, mostly white label techno records that would have on the B side an ambient track, a sort of beatless track. And over the years, I collected quite a lot of these, and they were really influential to my own production, and this is something that would happen when we was in the studio for a while. We work really hard on a bunch of beats where you have like 2 measures of music looping and you're moving a kick drum around for an hour and a half and then the snare drum. And after just hearing the beats for 2 days like that, it was really nice to just kick back and work on the ambient track for about 4 hours. So we felt this was kind of part of the process too. The dance music had a kind of flip side, which was the extreme chill out room. And we experienced that in 94 in a few sort of squat parties in Berlin, where this kind of music was played in a chill out room, and it had a kind of hypnotic effect. So when September 11th happened in New York City, a lot of my friends couldn't sleep very well. And we were constantly waking up in the middle of the night because there were a lot of sirens and jets and just weird noises, and everybody was a bit traumatized. So I put together a bunch of these tracks I'd made that were very neutral ambient tracks, and made an hour-long mix I called Sleep for people to put on when at night, maybe on repeat at an extremely low volume. So you could play it so it was almost not audible. And then when you'd wake up in the middle of the night because a jet went by or a siren, you could, you had this company, almost like a dog lying in the corner, just kind of calming you with a not overly happy and not like industrial doom, but some kind of neutral tones that made you feel like you had company, or it's kind of like calming medicine. So that mix I took on my first tour in Australia, and a young guy at the time, Lawrence English, who started the label Room 40, I gave him a copy and he just loved it. He completely flipped out and wanted to put it out, and I thought that would be a good place to put it out. He also said he'd put it on some nice packaging. So when I talked to him about that, I agreed, as long as he would release 2 more of these sleeping pills over the next bunch of years. So then I did that. I released Buoy. I actually released Buoy first with him, and then Sleep. He did such a good job with that I released Sleep finally, which had just been a CDR mix that I made. And then in 2008, I was invited by the Whitney Museum to do an installation there. And I did a piece around this kind of sleeping project with a handmade sort of triage tent and cots and an hour-long mix I called Triage. And so those are the 3 sleeping pills that were on Room 40. And I was kind of working on a new ambient project. I wasn't going to call it a sleeping pill, but it was similar kind of tracks I've been working on that came together for the soundtrack of listening to
That's
Fur.
great.
In 2012, Olive collected all of the tracks from the Sleeping Pill mixes and remastered them, along with a collection of previously unreleased tracks, for an incredibly rich 4-hour ambient release called Balm.
When I got up here, it took me a while, but I finally teamed up with some people and put together a pretty nice studio and had everything plugged in for the first time since I've been up in Canada. All my outboard gear, and I was able to do analog mixes. We had a decent Toft console. So I went back. I decided, well, one of the problems with these sleeping pills is they're an hour long. They're made up of 10 to 12 separate tracks, but I wanted them to be an hour long track when I released them. And they would get quieter and quieter. So you couldn't really ID yourself through it. You couldn't skip to the next track. So some people, they'd had it for years, but they would always fall asleep and they never even heard the end of the album. And I kind of liked that concept. But the problem was it was, I wanted them to be available as separate tracks in this new world of the digital, where records don't really matter. These tracks are off by themselves, just flying around on streaming sites. I mean, even people who download a whole album will have them in alphabetical order or something like that. So I had this idea to take all the tracks from all 3 sleeping pills, plus tracks that I wanted to use but didn't end up getting on. There was easily, folders full of tracks that didn't almost made it on these other sleeping pills. So I remastered all of those tracks individually and made, I think it's 38 track release. I think it's 4 hours of music. I forget.
Yeah, it's epic. It's sprawling.
So it's basically my collection of ambient works over the past 20 years. And one of those tracks from Balm, one of the unreleased tracks, is on Fur, listening to Fur. So that's a track called Titicaca Dawn that I did with Ignacio, aka 111, back in 96. So that's on the listening. It's
great.
To
it's
Fur.
Sort of like a circling back to the old roots.
Yeah.
Ambient music is only one part of DJ Olive's diverse output and tastes. From performing with bands to building beats in the studio, a wide variety of styles intersect and influence all of his work.
I think of music like industrial design, that you can work in a lot of different styles as long as they have a proper place to be used.
Yeah.
The right time, the right place. You don't play ambient music at the drum and bass party. And you don't play drum and bass at the ambient party.
Right.
You know, but it's a blast to work in these. You know, it's really fun to be in the studio working on beats, but then you feel like you've been in the studio and haven't talked to anyone. Then you get a call to come out and jam, and then you know, you take the turntables and you play with like a band on stage. It's completely different. It's not nothing about the music is something I'd want to record, but it's a blast to play. It's so far out of my comfort zone that I find it really challenging, and that makes me go back and work on my vinyl scores a little bit to make something that I can use in those situations. So
these experiences feed each other.
Yeah, they feed each other. They're not mutually exclusive. They're just part of, you know, me finding different ways to express myself that I feel are valid. Because at first, when I first tried to make my first solo record, Bodega, I got very involved in like trying to make the ultimate record. I got to put all my ideas in here, this idea and that idea. And you know what? They started canceling each other out because a record is only an hour. How many moods are you in 1 hour?
Yeah.
As a listener, you're basically in one. You're in a mood, and that's when you choose, you know? And when I choose...
That's a really good point, because when you hear music, when you hear somebody's album who, if they try to cram too many different feelings or styles of music, it inevitably, unless it's like I can't think of any off the top of my head, but inevitably they don't work.
Yeah, it starts to feel like a compilation, and I find myself on albums like that, I end up hitting the next ID. Yeah. I'll start on track 4, you know what I mean? Stuff like that. Whereas the albums I really love and would play a lot really were kind of like one mood.
Yeah.
DJ Olive online at djolive.com. Links in the show post.